In this lecture, we are going to be looking at the play American Son, written by Christopher Demas Brown. I asked you to get the Samuel French 2019 copy. Christopher Demas Brown's Broadway play by the same name opened during the winter season of 2018. Kenny Leon, who directed the play, returns for a film that is now on Netflix, as does the entire original Broadway cast. In addition to Kerry Washington and Stephen Pascal, we have Jeremy Jordan and Eugene Lee Starr. One thing I also want you to think about as you're reading this, some people have made comments about the author of this. Demas Brown is actually a white male, and I want you to think if that has any bearing on the work at all. He's a trial lawyer in Miami, and he has actually written over a dozen full-length plays. So what we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to introduce the characters a little bit, and I'm going to talk about some of the questions, some of the discussion questions I've posted on Blackboard for you. These discussion questions do not need to be answered and turned in, but you should be able to answer them, and I want you to think about them to get the main ideas of the play. Now, if we are having this as an in-class session, I'll be discussing these questions in class in detail, actually asking them of you in class. However, if this is either an online section or we are unable to have this class for whatever reason, this lecture will step in for that. So in the play itself, we actually only meet 4 characters. There are technically 5, but we never actually meet Jamal. Jamal could be argued as one of the main character because the play focuses around him. However, we never actually meet him. Characters are Kendra Ellis Connor. She is an African-American woman. She is a professor of psychology, and she's recently separated from her white husband. Her age is described as 40s to early 50s. Then we have Scott Connor. He is a white male. He is an FBI agent, and he is predominantly of Irish ancestry. He is described as rigid, but a deeply loving and devoted father, and he is late 40s to 50s. Then we have Officer Paul Larkin, who is a white male, mid-20s to 30s. He is intelligent, congenial, which means pleasant, friendly, and he has bold career ambitions. And then we have Lieutenant John Stokes, who is an African-American male, mid-50s to mid-60s, and he is a career police officer. He has paid his dues, and he knows the rules and has no hesitation in enforcing them. And then finally we have Jamal, who again we don't physically get to see, but he is Kendra and Scott's 18-year-old son. He is soon to graduate high school and is supposed to enroll at West Point. Now, the setting of the play is in the waiting room of a police station in Miami-Dade County in Florida. And the time of the play, it says early morning in this coming June after 4 a.m. And so what happens when we begin the play is Kendra is trying to find her son. She has been told the car he was in was involved in an incident, and she's trying to get more information from Officer Larkin. And so some things I want you to think about, right? We're looking at this, I want you, as you're reading and as we're discussing, to think about some of the biases or stereotypes, biases these characters have, and stereotypes that are followed in some ways. And why I'm having you read this play is because it's a reflection on what our society is still dealing with. And, we've talked about this in class where there's this idea that, racism is over, it's not as bad as it has been. But what we're going to see is these ideas of systematic racism that has literally been built into our system. And we've been looking at this throughout our section, the African American section in this class. So when we're looking at this, right, Kendra is trying to find her son. Look at what questions Officer Larkin asks about Jamal that may give insight into biases he may have. Some examples, and I'm not going to go through or give you the answers to all of these, but we'll discuss some of them. So questions Officer Larkin asks, some of them he asks if Jamal has ever been arrested before, which is a common question, right? But then when she says no, it seems like he doesn't believe her, and he continues on. No priors, not even juvie, not even trespassing, resisting, without, petty theft, right? He keeps asking about that. He also asks her about street names or aliases that he might have. He asks about any distinguishing marks, such as scars, tattoos, gold teeth. When she says that he has a scar on his stomach, he asks if it is a thick scar, which is the keloid scar. And what's interesting with this, right, these are thick raised scars, and they're actually seen 15 times more in people of sub-Saharan African descent. And so again, even that question that doesn't seem maybe that it's racial, it actually does have racial intentions to it. He also, when he wrongly quotes Emily Dickinson, she dismisses him when she tells him that's Charles Dickens, not Emily Dickinson. He gets Jamal's name wrong. He calls him Jerome. And he keeps getting her name wrong. He keeps calling her Mrs. Connor. That's not her name. Her name is Ellis Connor, and technically it should be Dr. Ellis Connor. Right? And then also, when we're looking at Kendra, is Kendra honest with Officer Larkin? When Scott comes in, what is the relation? Oh, I'm sorry, before that, how does Kendra feel about Officer Larkin? And we see this very quickly once Scott comes in. And what is the relationship between Kendra and Scott like? Remember, they are separated. Look at how Officer Larkin reacts when Kendra asks him if he has a black son. And one of my questions is, do you think Kendra is justified in her fear for her son? And there's an interesting little moment where Kendra asks for water, and Officer Larkin tries to be helpful, and he tells her where the water fountain is. And in fact, there are actually the two different water fountains. And did you pick up on why there are? It's because it's an old building, and they actually existed during segregation. So there were one for each of the white race and the colored race. Scott then arrives, and what do we see what happens when, who does Larkin think Scott is, and what is his comment to him, right? He says on page 26, she went from zero to ghetto in like nothing flat. And then look at how Larkin treats Scott. How does he treat Scott differently than how he treated Kendra, and why do you think this was so? And then how does Kendra feel about how Scott treats Larkin? Right? She says she's not happy because he's basically kissing his butt. Then we have the interaction between Kendra and Scott, right? And this is interesting. This is where they're talking about language. And Scott says, doesn't get to talk white trash. And she says, he doesn't speak Ebonics, you don't get to speak white trash. And then there's this interesting conversation between the two of them, right? Scott claims he didn't make make Jamal fit in. And he even says the name, hey, I let you name him Jamal. And there's this conversation that writes that Seamus was too Irish, but Jamal is too black. And Kendra claims that he calls him Jay because it is too black. And then Scott makes some comments about Jamal's appearance the last couple times he has seen him. And then it's interesting to hear that when Scott learns that Jamal is driving around with two black kids that they don't know, right, he looks at this as, somehow Kendra's fault and something he shouldn't be doing. So I want you to talk about, to think about this relationship between them. And Kendra talks at one point about what keeps her up most nights. And she makes a reference to Arthur McDuffie. Arthur McDuffie, this is a reference. In 1979, McDuffie was a 33-year-old insurance agent and a former Marine. He was beaten into a coma by a dozen white Dade County police officers after he ran a red light in his motorcycles. The officers immediately tried to cover up their crime to stage it as an accident, and McDuffie died several days later from his injuries. The police officers were acquitted, and riots then followed. And this is something that she says is always in her mind, right? Being the mother of a young black son. We find out that Jamal has also been reconsidering his future, right? He's supposed to be going to West Point, and he's been reconsidering it. Scott's angry because he says every generation in his family has somehow served in the military since they got here. Then we find out that Larkin returns, and he gives them more information that Jamal was pulled over for a general infraction. Two other boys were not people they had known, and one actually had an open warrant. And then there's this whole conversation about the bumper sticker that is on the car. And the bumper sticker says, shoot cops with your phone whenever they make a bust. But the shoot cops is in very large letters and the rest is small. And I want you to think about how Scott and Larkin react to this, how Kendra reacts to it, and eventually how does Officer Stokes react to this bumper sticker, because it comes very important. We also get some insight into Scott when he talks about the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement. I said that kind of funny. And then we find out that Jamal has actually been angry with his father, and find out about, look at why Jamal has been angry with his father. Eventually, we get Lieutenant Stokes who comes in, and I want you to think, what are your impressions of Lieutenant Stokes, and what kind of biases or beliefs do we see that he has? Think about his interaction with Scott and what happens, and then his interaction with Kendra is also very interesting and gives us different insights into these characters. And so when we're looking at this, right, Stokes even talks about the bumper sticker. And he says, right, this is very telling when he says, a black boy in a car with a bumper sticker that is asking for trouble. That it tells him the world is not the same place for people who look like you and me. And he's saying this to Kendra. Okay? And I want you to think, how does Kendra react to this? Right? She claims that Stokes works for her, not the other way around. And she says that black boys don't act gangster to be hard, they do it to hide their fear. And then pay attention to what Stokes says about this, right? Right, especially when he says the comment, make sure he understands that for us, there ain't no American dream. And he also says, if the Young brothers would have just shut their mouths and done what they were told, none of us would be here tonight. And think about, what he means by that. What do these comments mean? And then we find out, right, how did Kendra actually really feel about this bumper sticker? And then we find out, I'm not going to tell you the ending, you have to read it, but the play ends, right, with Scott's last words, and he says, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And I want you to think about what this is a reference to. And it's actually a reference to the I Can't Breathe as a slogan associated with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. The phrase originated from the last words of Eric Garner, who was an unarmed black man who was killed in 2014 after being put in a chokehold by New York City police. A number of other African Americans, such as Javier Ambler, Manuel Ellis, Elijah McClain, and George Floyd, have said the same phrase prior to dying during law enforcement encounters. According to a 2020 report by the New York Times, the phrase has been used by over 70 people who have died in police custody. The phrase is used in a worldwide protest against police brutality in the United States and against the lack of police accountability due to qualified immunity. And so I want you to think about, again, these are just part of the topics in this play, but I also want you to think about, how this play is a reflection of our times. And it's looking at institutional racism, also known as systemic racism. This is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, education, among many other things. And so I want you to look at some of these issues that this play raises and how they're directly trying to address these issues that are still in our society today and are there because of this systemic racism, this systematic racism that has been in our country. Hopefully you can now see through what we've been looking at. It's been in our country since its beginnings. So please take the time. You can watch the Netflix movie. However, you're definitely going to need to read the play. It's only 76 pages, goes very quickly. But I just want to touch on some of the topics. Make sure you read the discussion questions and that you are able to answer them.